do a couple of screencasts. And today on the daily schedule, if you look at the daily schedule, we were supposed to talk about disturbance in succession. And at the end of that conversation, we were going to bring in the concept of resource-limited competition to illustrate how that can be used to understand the changes that go on during succession. And so while that was part of what we were supposed to do today, I decided to just go ahead and do all of that in a screencast so that we could actually just answer any questions you have about that and then move on to a discussion of the introduction of the Veen et al. Paper. So by delivering that screencast that way, it frees us up a little bit to have some time to talk about the Veen et al. Paper. Everybody close your eyes. Close your eyes, nothing bad is going to happen. Close them, close them, close them. As quietly as you can, raise your hand if you did view the screencast. Okay, good. Some people are like, yeah, whatever, sort of did them. Yeah, put your hands down, open your eyes. That's good. Sometimes people don't want to show that they did work because you don't look cool in front of your peers. I never had that problem. I looked uncool my entire life. So you looked at the two screencasts. One was designed to finish off the introduction to Kanza. The other one was to introduce you to the idea of disturbance in succession and competition. What questions do you have? I expect you to have some questions. Yeah?
I was just kind of confused with like the graphs showing all the like successions. I didn't quite understand.
The competition graphs?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one of the questions that I kind of expected, because this is a different way of looking at competition than the way you looked at it in the past. And so it doesn't really surprise me that much that you have that question. So before, and this is maybe how I should do it next time I present this to a class. Before, when we did competition, we had the number of species 1 on one axis and the number of species 2 on the other axis. And then these zero net growth isochlines represented, species 2, zero net growth isochline, species 1, zero net growth isochline. K1 is here, K2 is there, K1 over alpha is here, K2 over beta is here. And if you were down here, both species were growing, and if you're up here, both species were declining. And if you're in here, species 1 is declining, species 2 is growing. If you're in here, species 2 is declining, species 1 is growing. And then you end up at an equilibrium point. And so here, resources aren't a part of anything. Resources are just kind of assumed back there in the background, driving the dynamics, but they're not explicit in the model. The way that resources influence the model is by slowing things down in terms of population growth or resulting in declining population growth when resources are limiting and not providing that when resources are in great abundance. And so over here, if we want to make the transition from one way of thinking about competition to another, down here is a situation where resources are high. Up here is a situation where resources are low. When resources are low, you can't grow as much. What Tillman did was he basically designed a way of envisioning competition where you make resource supply explicit. And so his way of doing it is, if you have one resource like light, is the example that I use, from no light to a lot of light, and a second resource, which is something like nitrogen, where you have a lot of nitrogen or no nitrogen, what are the specific resources that an individual species needs to exhibit population growth, positive population growth? Well, in early successional species, you have species that are in environments that are high light because there's not anybody else there, but they're in low nutrients, also because there's nobody else there. And so these are species that tend to need a lot of light and very little in the And so this represents a zero net growth isoocline in the same way that we have zero net growth isooclines here, except this zero net growth isoocline shows the ratio of light and nitrogen at which point that species is exhibiting zero growth. So if you're anywhere along these lines, the population of species A is exhibiting zero net growth. And so the landscape that you're on here is a landscape of resources, not a landscape of population size. And if you find yourself in this area here, you don't have enough light to exhibit positive population growth. And so over here, dn of A over dt is negative, it's declining. Over here, you have plenty of light and also plenty of nitrogen. So at this point, the change in the population size of species A over time is positive, and everywhere on that line, it's zero. Because here, it's zero, not because you're lacking light, but because you're lacking enough nitrogen to experience positive population growth. Here, you're at zero population growth, not because there's not enough nitrogen, you have plenty of nitrogen, it's that there's not enough light for you to experience positive population growth. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
And so then you can draft competition, because at this point it's just one species. There might be another species, the purple species, species B, that needs a lot of nitrogen, but needs very little light. A lot of nitrogen and very little light. This is a late successional species where there's a lot of competition for light because there's a lot of plants on the landscape competing with their leaves for light supply. But because there are a lot of plants on the ground growing there, they're also shedding leaves and building soil and things like that. So there's usually more nutrient availability. And so once again, this represents dn, this is species B. This is the line for species B. This is dnB over dt. And in this case, it's declining over here, and it's positive over there. Declining over here, positive over here. For this species, it's positive growth over here, negative growth over here, also negative growth in this little narrow space. And so these zero net growth isooclines just show you what is actually doing the limiting on population growth to result in zero net growth. And it also shows you resource conditions under which each species is growing or not as a population. And where they intersect, right here, what would we call that? What do we call this?
Equilibrium.
It's an equilibrium point. It's a point where both species are both exhibiting what? Zero population growth, zero net growth. And so this is an equilibrium point. But also, all of these are equilibrium points as well. It's just that at this point, it's an equilibrium point where species 1, or species B rather, is experiencing zero net growth, and species 2 has done what? Sorry, species A. Species B is doing zero net growth. What is species A doing at this point? It's declining, and if you leave it there long enough, it will decline to extinction. Yeah. So if you want to know where they can then coexist, what do? You basically say, well, how does this species use resources? Well, for every unit of light that this species needs, it needs very little nitrogen. So it is more limited by light than it is by nitrogen. The purple species, species B, for every unit of nitrogen that it needs very little light. And so the distance from the origin of no resources at all to where these lines make the bend is a measure of how much of which resource they need the most. And so it's clear that this species needs nitrogen a lot more than it needs light. This species needs light a lot more than it needs nitrogen. If you have two species that have those two sets of resource needs, what can they do? They can coexist. Not only that, they can coexist across a wide range of conditions because their resource needs are not very similar to one another. And so if you start out here where there's a ton of light and a ton of nutrients, which you won't find in ecosystems very often, if you put them in a field where there's a lot of light, you've plowed up everything, you put them in a field, there's a lot of light, you're giving them a lot of fertilizer, you're starting them way out here. What happens to both populations as they're in this field with lots of light and lots of nutrients? They're both growing. They're both growing gangbusters. As they grow, what happens to resource availability? It declines, and it will decline to this equilibrium point. But if you start way over here, it will also decline to this equilibrium point. But as soon as you cross this boundary, it declines towards the equilibrium point, but because of where you start, it hits one species limit before it reaches the other species limit. In this case, because you started out close to species A's limit, you hit species A's limit sooner. And at that point, what is species A doing? Zero net growth. What is species B doing? It's continuing to grow because it has enough nitrogen and enough light to do so. As it grows, what does it do to the supply of nitrogen and light? Decreases it, which takes you over this line. And at that point, what's happening to species A? It's declining. Species B is still growing, and it will grow to its equilibrium point, which is down here, where it is now growing at zero net growth because it has used up all of the available light and all of the available nitrogen, and then it will just stop there. That's the point at which the number of births equals the number of deaths, because it's right on the edge of what it needs to survive. Same thing if you started here, except when you start here, you get to species B's limit first, because you start out closer to species B's limit. And so this is a situation where there is a lot of either or. In some cases, you can coexist if you find yourself starting in the right place, but in other cases, you find one species winning or the other species winning. And it all depends on where you start, not in population size space, but in resource space. Does that help?
Yeah.
And if you can do this with 2 species, you can do it with 50 species. It becomes a little messier and hard to follow the details, but you can do it with as many species as you can imagine living on a landscape with one another. Other questions about anything in the screencasts? Draw for me where species can coexist and where they can't. explain to the class what you're doing as you're doing it.
Okay. So species can coexist in like this area.
Exactly where can they coexist?
Wait, exactly?
Exactly.
Isn't there any area like in here because both of them had the right requirements for nitrogen?
No, I think that area is way too big of an area. Somebody help Connor.
Where the two lines intersect.
Go up and help him. Connor, stay at the board. Austin, go help him.
I think species can coexist right here where neither one is.
Okay, they can coexist right there where the lines intersect, certainly, so put that up there. Where else can they coexist? How do you decide where they can coexist in resource space, resource supply space?
Where there's enough resources available for both species.
Okay, but that's anywhere to the upper right, which is kind of what Connor drew, which is just a big blob in the upper right. But is that sufficiently narrow? Anyone in the class?
Draw the lines, the purple from 0 to where the purple right angle.
Go help us. Before we know it, everybody in class is going to be at the board. Explain to us what you're doing as you're doing it.
I don't know how to explain. Is it the 0 net growth isoform?
Those are zero net growth isochrones that are up there.
So then.
So draw a dash line that you think you need to draw. Okay, what does that dash line represent?
How well the two resources are able to be used relative to each other.
Okay, it's a line that represents the relative abundance of nitrogen that species needs. And you do that with, is that a purple line? I can't really tell from back here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so continue and explain as you go.
Where's the black one? And then this is the same thing, just for species A. And then at the equilibrium point, you just move the line supply nitrogen, like where the line is.
So you need to make the lines parallel from the
Yeah.
equilibrium point, right? Yeah. So just make your guess best guess. So Connor, is your circle correct?
No, not really.
No, it's too wide, isn't
Yeah.
it? Why is it too wide? Well, because you didn't consider what the resource needs in a precise way when you go to figure out where that region is. You have to consider those lines are basically what we refer to as resource utilization vectors. It shows you how those two species use light and use nitrogen. Those lines are not quite 45 degrees in there, but they're close to 45 degrees, which means that they're using nitrogen and light in about the same proportion. Not only that, what are their combined resource utilizations? Are they similar to one another or not very similar to one another?
Similar.
They're really similar to one another. Because they're really similar to one another, they can't coexist over a wide range of resource supplies because they both need the same resources at about the same rates. Draw for me, I think I left did I leave a black line?
Yeah.
Connor, stay up there, the other two sit down. Draw for me a situation in which two species cannot coexist at any point.
So.
Erase what's up there, just keep the axes.
So when they can't coexist, that's just gonna be like,
Draw me a graph with zero network acid ions such that the two species can never coexist.
I'm not really sure how to like draw that. Like,
Okay, think through it. This is all about resource need and resource use. When can two species not coexist relative to what their resource needs are?
well, when the resource needs like aren't being met, or
Or when you have two species whose resource needs are what?
different.
Who said that? Gabe, the same. Who helped Connor?
How many of you have siblings? Do any of you, when you were a kid at dinner, you didn't eat fast enough, you would get seconds? You guys experience that? No? Come on, man.
I always say that, so.
You always eat fast. So you can think about your siblings, they have the same resource needs as you. If they had different resource needs, then y'all would be eating different dinners anyway, so you're not competing. So you've got to think, okay, got to think of this as two siblings kind of fighting over the same stuff, right?
Explain yourself, Gabe.
So when two different plants or
Sure, plants, that works.
when
Plant
they need
species.
the same resources, they're competing over the same thing. So if one gets more than the other, then that one's gonna kind of decline. If vice versa happens, then
That is exactly the situation where you have two species that can't coexist because both species need what in terms of resources?
like
Exactly the same thing and in the same amounts. And so what's going to determine competition in that case is who arrives at the site first. They're going to be the ones that win because they get to build up the population size before the other one gets there. So yeah, that's what I was getting at. Thanks. All right. What did we just demonstrate? Teamwork, sure. What else did we demonstrate? The way you study and learn this kind of stuff that is kind of foreign and difficult at the beginning is you sit down and you play around with it. You practice it. You draw it on a piece of paper. You draw it on a whiteboard. You recruit your friends who maybe understand it just a wee bit more than you do. You don't visit it once on a screencast, read about it in the book, because actually they don't present Tillman-style competition models in the book. They stop with the Lotka-Volterra models that we did last time. So they don't even present this to you in the book. But it's a good way of understanding succession, and so it's a good way to wrap your head around. You don't do it by watching the screencast once, reading about it in a book once. You get to know it by practicing it. And the only way to practice it is to draw some graphs and ask yourself some questions about this. What's the problem with studying this kind of thing alone? Hmm?
You don't know if it's right.
You might not know if it's right. What else is a problem with studying this kind of thing alone?
you can't see your mistakes.
You can't see your mistakes. That's related to you don't know when you're right. The thing I'm looking for is related to that.
The problem is something you do know, because you don't necessarily know what you don't.
Because you don't necessarily know which questions you should be asking yourself. And as a result, having somebody else who can ask you questions that you haven't even thought about is useful and beneficial. And so I'm not a big fan of group study the way most students practice it, because the way most students practice group study is they get together in a group and they go over their notes, which is about the most useless use of your time you can possibly do, except going home and playing World of Warcraft or something. But group study, where you're quizzing one another about the material that you have, where you're drawing scenarios on the board and asking your peers what are the outcomes of those scenarios, that is good, productive group study time. And this is the kind of thing that group study time really helps with. Assuming that you've all prepared to come to group study time
and you have some basic working knowledge, and then you can build on it in group study time. They figured stuff out between 4 people that none of them could have probably figured out on their own, because some people have more knowledge than other people, and they worked through it. This is a good way to study. Questions about screencast? Other questions? Yeah.
You were showing the succession,
Uh-huh.
thing where there are many species in a row and slowly would, based on the shift in resources, the balance and equilibrium would change.
Uh-huh.
And so what interested me was, is there a way, because you mentioned that the species at one end of that succession compete not that much with the species at the other end. So is it possible for the species on opposite ends to coexist and thus push out the species in the middle?
Not really, because for this species to exist with this species, this species can, well, let me think about this. In a successional, so if you went out into an environment and just plunked a couple of species down, then yes, in theory, but that's not actually how succession works. Succession begins with one ratio of resources relative to one another and slowly moves to the other one. If you took the orange species and the white species and just plunked them out there, then yeah, they would be able to coexist. But one of the other things that you have to consider is that they could only be coexisting at places that have quite a lot of nitrogen and quite a lot of light. And so even if you plunk them down, you would only be able to plunk them down in specific kinds of environments and have them coexist. And those are both high resource area environments. And so while they could, in theory, coexist over a broad range of resources, those broad ranges of resources are all relatively high. And to get to a point through succession where species 6 is thriving, you had to get rid of all of these other species on your way there. So yeah, it's one of those things where in theory, yes, but only under a limited set of conditions that are all really resource high. Does that make sense? Yeah. Other questions? All right. I'm going to mix things up. Starting over here, number yourselves off in 6s.
6.
Asa, 4.
2, 3, 4, 5.
1, 2.
1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s. Talk to people you haven't talked to in a while. Once you get settled, I'm going to give you some instructions. All of you should have 5 groups except group. No, all of you should have 5 except you guys should have 4. All right, great. So those of you who were in lab yesterday, we started talking about your lab report, and we started talking about the different sections of a research paper and what those sections of a research paper do, what's their purpose, how are they structured, and things like this. So those of you who were in lab yesterday will be able to help out those of you who weren't in lab yesterday. We're going to go through this with the other groups in lab tomorrow. But one of the things that you should ask yourself when you read an introduction at this point is, what's the purpose of an introduction? How is the introduction structured? Is it just a bunch of random information thrown against a wall in any particular order? Or is there actually a structure to it? How do the authors treat prior knowledge is another thing that you can learn, because you will have to treat prior knowledge yourself when you write your lab report. How do they write about it? One of the things that disappointed me a little bit yesterday in lab was when students talked about the introduction. They talked about treating prior knowledge, and they framed it in terms of avoiding plagiarism rather than in terms of how do I write an introduction that's readable. And you can avoid plagiarism while also making something readable. Ask yourself, whenever your authors write about other people's work, how do they do it? Do they do it by starting off sentences like, the researchers in such and such a study said blah, blah, blah? Or do they do something that's a little smoother and more efficient in terms of words and things like this? So don't just look at, are they citing things appropriately? Look at how they're writing about things. The way you become a good writer is by reading the writing of good writers. And in addition to all of that, so be asking yourself these questions as you go through and discuss. And you should discuss each of these questions as you go through the introduction. You should also be addressing the other thing is, which is, what is this paper really about? Because presumably, what are they doing in the introduction? They're introducing what the paper is really about.
And they should be convincing you that the paper is worth your time, right?
Yes.
And so that's what you want to do when you're writing up your research for us. Convince us that it's important enough for us to keep reading. I mean, some scientific papers you read, you'll start reading them and be like, no, I'm not going to spend the rest of my time on this. Others, you'll say, okay, I understand why it's important, why I should keep reading. Sometimes scientists are good writers and others are not.
Every year when we do this, when we do these papers, I reread them. And so I have the benefit of having read these papers a long time. And so one of the things that I did last night as I was rereading this again to get ready for today is I highlighted the parts of it that I thought were really essential. I'm not a big fan of highlighting, but sometimes highlighting is a good tool. What is it in this introduction that was really necessary for me to understand what they were doing? Or is there a lot of just extraneous information in this introduction that isn't really crucial in order for me to get what's coming afterwards? And so that's another thing that you should be looking at is it an efficient introduction? Is it only giving you the absolutely crucial information that you need? Or is there just a bunch of fluffy stuff that you kind of have to fight through to get to the stuff that's really important?
Sometimes, especially when you're first learning about things, you write and you sort of write down all that you know about the topic. If you go back to it and look at your writing and you say, okay, the main point of this writing is X, do my readers really need to know everything I know about this, or can I eliminate some? I still do that with my writing.
What she is talking about, sorry, not efficient. That was the thing I said a minute ago. Sufficient. I've already told you I'm a quick and dirty drafter. What is a quick and dirty drafter? Yeah.
Someone who throws all their ideas onto the page and then refines them.
Just get it down, get it down. I've got a flow in my head and I want to get it down before I lose the order in which I want things to come out, because I've arrived at a good order, I've thought about what a good order is, And I'm not concerned about grammar and stuff like that. And so I'm a quick and dirty drafter. I just blurt it all out there in what I think is a good order, and then I go back and I tinker with it a lot. And so I will write a quick and dirty draft that then goes through a number of revisions. The first revision that I do after I've written it all down is I go through and sentence by sentence I ask myself, is this information necessary? And if it's not, I highlight it and hit the delete key. I do that sentence by sentence. Is it necessary to the purpose of the paper? And then when I'm done with that, guess what? My paper is much shorter. And so now I go back and I read it and I say, okay, now that I've gotten rid of all of that unnecessary crap that wasn't doing anybody any good, what am I missing to bring my audience along to where I want them to be? And I realize that now what I have isn't sufficient to the task, and so I go back and I fill in gaps. Oh, to get from this idea to this idea, I needed this thing in the middle to bring the audience along. And then after I've done that, guess what I do? I go back and I look at all that stuff that I added and say, okay, how much unnecessary stuff got into there? Highlight it and delete it, highlight it and delete it, highlight it and delete it. Then I go back and ask, okay, now is it still sufficient? And after a couple of rounds of that, you have a paper that is very efficient. It has everything the reader needs to follow where you're going, and it has nothing in it that you don't need to follow where you're going.
Now, just to point out, if you did that method but submitted the paper before you did any revision, what would happen?
They would tell you to get rid of, they would take a classic editor comment, reduce the introduction by 25% or 50% or whatever. Or they would just send it back to you and say, don't dirty our doorsteps with this piece of trash ever again.
And so even the best writers, even if you don't do the quick and dirty method, even if you're crafting sentences
Sure.
very carefully, it's going to require revision. So try to make sure that you give yourself enough time to have an entire draft and to go back and do rounds of revision, even if you are a very careful drafter in the first place.
My first paper, I took a technical writing class as an undergraduate, and the first paper that I wrote for publication in grad school, I sent it off to the Journal of Herpetology, which is not a great journal, although I probably should have sent it something better, but I was a master's student at the time, so I thought if I could get something published anywhere, that was good. I sent it off, and it's the only paper that I've ever submitted where the editor wrote back and basically said, we were all of the consensus that the introduction could be a little longer. Like, go into a little more detail, round out your ideas a little more. I had been trained by my technical writing instructor in this way of writing, that I had trimmed the thing down to the point that the editors actually wanted more. What I've typically gotten since then is trim the introduction by such amount, which is not very helpful because 25%, well, where does that 25% come? Like, which part of the 25%? It's much better when they give you actual ideas as to where you've gone overboard with something and what really is extraneous. But a lot of times I don't take the time to do that. You have to then go and figure out what that is. The other thing is some journals have page limits, word count limits. My partner is revising something that she submitted to Evolution, and she got through all of the revisions and realized she was like 300 words over the word limit. Well, then she needs to trim something down. She has to then ask herself, what in there is really necessary for the thing to make sense? And then once she gets rid of all of that, is it now still sufficient to do the job?
I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing that in that first instance where they asked you to go into more details in the introduction, that it was more things like convincing your audience that it's important to know and increasing their interest, maybe leading them along a little bit more.
Actually, I think it was, at the time that it was written, it was a paper about competition. And we did a really good job of explaining what competition is, why resource utilization is a good way to measure competition. But we didn't spend nearly enough time dealing with the controversies that had proceeded over the last decade about that as a way of doing it.
So they wanted you to address those.
They wanted us to address those concerns to better justify why we were doing things the way we did. But when we went through it, we were trying to have the discussion amongst us. It was me and 3 other people. We had the discussion, is it really necessary to rehash the last decade of ecological thought? And we're like, no, because anybody who's familiar with competition theory knows about this controversy that's been going on. And we got the impression that they wanted us to go through that. So now when you read the current version of the paper, the version that was published, there's like 2 whole paragraphs about this decade-long controversy about the importance of competition and how it can be measured. That we didn't think was necessary, but somebody else thought it was. And it didn't really change the paper very much, but it did make the introduction long. So, these are the things that you should discuss with reference to the Veen et al. Paper. You have your summaries. You also have the original paper. Go to it. We will be circulating. Do you have anything to add, Dr. Reynolds, before we proceed?
Nope, I think this is good.
Those of you in lab yesterday, help your peers who weren't in lab yesterday.
I guess the one thing I would add is, try to take notes on these things
Oh, sure.
rather than just discussing them verbally.
Oh, because you need to probably.
Is it the phosphorus?
I still don't understand the English function of sounds.
I'll take them up still. Good.
It basically introduces you to what the entire paper is going to be about.
Plus you're getting the practice aspect of it.
Will this be revising board summaries too?
You may also revise each other's, but I'd like you to focus on these first, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a peer review session.
Yeah.
Grassland communities and that some what are things that raise a social disturbance, topography, stuff like that. Zero grassland.
Yeah, like when they refer to a prior study.
I see that paper.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes they just make a statement and then they refer.
But in the purposes
What starts?
the context of your
I'm confused.
We just like, is it right from this?
They want information that supports
One of the things they say,
things that
You just like listening.
Yeah.
Except for this one quiz, which was really recently fallen into me study the interactive effects of grazing. This is the only time where they actually put the sentence reverse. This is referred to this is in the first full
Recently, Collins in 2006 studied the interactive effects of dreams. So it just includes of the
Yes.
their reception.
What are we doing? Frankly, I don't see how this is important.
It's just like giving the guidelines on how to
No, I'm just saying, I just don't have a meeting.
Well, he's moved to our belief. Yes. That's gonna suck.
Because there's no private house.
I think you just know.
I could.
That's true. I don't even like my students. Did you guys click on the videos?
I'm listening. Okay, we'll just continue. I'm just listening.